Hi there, and welcome back to Season 2 of Cyburst, a podcast about science, popular culture, and entertainment. We are your hosts, Ella and
Isabel, two science communicators and sci-fi nerds steering this spaceship alongside guests into the multiverse of science fun. Today's episode, Fables, Science and Technology Morals, and Decentering the Human.
Sounds so exciting. This episode is going to be structured a little differently from Season 1 because today we have a very special guest with us, our friend and our cybernetic colleague, Professor Chris Danta. Chris, do you want to say hi to everyone?
Hi everyone, how are you?
I hope they're all saying hi in the comments of this podcast. Before we dive into the topic today and talk about all the cool things and thoughts that Chris has and does, it's really important that we acknowledge that this episode of Cyburst is being recorded on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. Indigenous Australians are the first scientists, artists and storytellers, and we'd like to pay our respects to elders past, present, emerging and future, acknowledging that First Australians are the longest continuing storytellers.
Okay, cool. So I thought I would kick us off with a little bit of background on today's topic. I think most of our listeners will know what a fable is, but I still think it's a good place to start with a definition to ground everybody. So a fable is defined in the Oxford Dictionary as a short story, typically with animals as characters conveying a moral. So it's a succinct standalone fictional tale that often features legendary creatures, plants, inanimate objects, or forces of nature that are anthropomorphized, meaning they're attributed human traits. And the story usually leads to a particular moral lesson, which is sometimes turned into a popular saying. So a fable people might be very familiar with is The Tortoise and the Hare, which is the story about a race between a tortoise, a slow-moving animal who's very humble, and a hare, a fast-moving animal who is also a bit of a show-off and overconfident in the story. And basically what happens is the hare races far ahead of the tortoise at the start and, being very confident of their triumph, falls asleep halfway through the race, thinking, oh yeah, I can beat this tortoise guy. And then when the hare wakes up, he finds that his competitor is actually crawling slowly but steadily and has arrived before him to the finish line and wins. This is where the saying slow and steady wins the race originated from. And that's sort of the moral of that story. So that fable is quite an old example. But there are more recent forms of the fable that explore different sets of values and morals, and some of these actually relate to science and the evolving relationship between humans and animals and also machines.
Wow, what a spoiler for discussions soon to come. No, good lead-in, Isabel. And to further lead in, I want to give a bit of an introduction to our fabulous guest today, Chris. So for those of you who aren't fortunate enough to work alongside him, I wish you could be us. It's fantastic. But Chris is a professor of literature at the ANU School of Cybernetics. So Chris has done a BA at ANU, has received honours in English at the University of Melbourne, and also completed a PhD in comparative literature at Monash University. Chris's research operates at the intersection of literary theory, philosophy, science, and theology. And he calls himself a literary anthropologist, and is interested in how literary writers rethink what it means to be human by drawing on other knowledge systems such as religion and science. So Chris, currently at the ANU, is working on an ARC Future Fellowship with the title Future Fables, Literature, Evolution and Artificial Intelligence, if that signposts a little bit of where we'll go today. And interestingly, Chris, you have a keen interest in music and have been accused of mistaking the sound of a fridge for interesting music.
Yes, I love experimental music, and I've got into it a lot, and some, especially in the early 90s when I was listening. There's literally a record I have called Fridge Tracks, and that was music that was made by an Austrian electronic artist, recording sounds of the fridge and then manipulating those sounds into music. And
that's fantastic.
Music was very obviously experimental, ambient, and so I loved that sort of music, and but others maybe not so much. And so that's where I've sort of got that kind of reputation.
Yeah, that's so cool. And I kind of wish we could have a whole episode just talking about experimental music with you. But I thought maybe we'd start kicking off into talking about today's topic of fables by talking about a description you have of yourself in your bio as a literary anthropologist, which is a really cool term. I was wondering if you could explain to our listeners, why do you describe yourself with that term and what does it encompass for you?
Yeah, thanks. I'd also like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of land and elders past and present. Yeah, it's a term I've actually called myself. So it was a kind of funny moment a few years ago where I just went, I think this work I'm doing, has a certain flavour to it, and I said, I literally, you have the ability to change your bio on your academic profile, and I wrote literary anthropologist. And what I mean by this is simply that I'm interested in the question of what does it mean to be human, and literature is my source material. So how do literary writers think about what it means to be human? And I didn't think twice about it, but now having just noted that term, a few people have raised it, say, oh, you describe yourself as a literary anthropologist, what do you mean? And I think one thing to say is, it doesn't exist. It's not a category. There aren't a bunch of us who call ourselves literary anthropologists. Anthropology is obviously a hugely established field. But I think it was a kind of question of putting my neck on the line, I think, and saying, well, this is what I do. After years and years of doing things a certain way, I went, okay, I'm going to own it. I'm going to come out and say, well, this is what I do. This is what interests me. And, the funny thing is I've even been quoted as a literary anthropologist, which is...
Well, we just quoted you as well.
I've kind of snuck that term into the lexicon, and I thought it'd be great to have a conference or something on what is literary anthropology.
Oh my gosh,
like
yeah.
But,
I would go to that.
Anyway, so it's sort of, on the one hand, a kind of putting my the money where my mouth is or whatever, and then but also, so I take it very seriously, and that question of what does it mean to be human, and how does literature help us to think about that?
Yeah, that's amazing. Have you ever come across anybody else who's called themselves a literary anthropologist, or just? Well,
no, that's I mean, maybe not being a trained anthropologist. Something that's interesting is when I did my undergrad, I did anthropology for a year. So it was really something that I find in my career is that all these decisions you made very early on, you actually never leave those areas. And so, I did a bit of history, I did a bit of anthropology, and I've incorporated all those early disciplines into my practice. But I haven't actually met, and it might be political in the sense of, like anthropologists might not appreciate.
Yeah, they don't want to use the word. Yeah.
Calling them someone.
They shouldn't gatekeep the term. Yes. So people are allowed to. I don't know. I think it's very descriptive. Yeah, I love it.
Maybe in the future we'll see some more. Maybe after this episode comes out, we'll start seeing literary anthropologists popping up everywhere. I wonder if there's lots of people who do similar things to you who've been searching for a term that they feel really,
Yeah, because when I first heard you use it, I was actually like, oh, does this kind of describe what I do as well when I read like a piece of science or a piece of fiction that's grounded in a science and how I like analyze it. But yeah, I think it's a great term. I think we might move into a bit of intro to your work, Chris. So do you want to tell us a bit about your work on Fables, how you got into it, and maybe where it's at now?
Yeah, no, thanks. So I think something that this again does is takes me back to my PhD. This is PhDs are these kind of amazing things where you sort of are thinking about so many different things that reforms you intellectually. And it was a kind of spin-off of the PhD. I was doing the story of Genesis 22, which is a very famous biblical story of Abraham sacrificing his son Isaac. So, in the story, God says to Abraham, it's terrible. He says, go and sacrifice your son Isaac. And it's a story basically of faith. And Abraham obeys the command. He says, this is what I've been commanded to do. Interestingly, he never tells, one of the aspects of the story, he never tells his wife Sarah that he's gone to take his son off to sacrifice him. But he goes to take Isaac to be sacrificed. They climb Mount Moriah. And then at the last minute, just as literally he's bound him, he's taken the knife out to sacrifice him. And the angel of the Lord stops him and says, you don't have to sacrifice your son. You can sacrifice this ram that's been caught by its horns in a thicket just nearby. So what happens at the end of the story? There's a substitution. The ram is sacrificed, and Isaac is released. And I think I've got this strong interest in this idea of substitution. What happens when, in such a symbolic event? So this is a story of faith. Abraham shows his faith by sacrificing, by being willing to sacrifice his son, and then doesn't have to do it. An animal is sacrificed instead. And as after my PhD, I just became more and more interested in this. As I wrote the PhD up to be a book, I actually emphasised that dimension, the sense in which there's non-human animal involved. And basically, this is what happens in Fables. I think you get that substitution of the animal character in the story. As for sort of being a kind of anthropocentric species, where we're used to hearing stories about ourselves, but Fables I find really interesting because they tell us stories that are centered on non-human animals.
Yeah.
And that's what is so fascinating. And so in some ways you could say, well, Genesis 22 is a fable about involving a ram. That's sort of
yes.
And of course, no one really looks at it that way, but that's a kind of interesting sort of change of perspective. And so, the more, as I came out of my PhD, I remember literally talking to my supervisor saying, what can I work on? He said, well, people are, I'm doing work on animal studies. Andrew Benjamin was my PhD supervisor. He said, why don't you could do some work on animal studies? Then I remember convening a one-day symposium. And so, the rest is sort of history. We sort of, it was animals in literature. And then we had a number of really interesting speakers, and I just kept doing that work. And the reason I picked Fables in a way is that focus they have, like the sort of misperception I felt that people have of them. So traditionally, as Isabel was saying, Fables are kind of moral story involving an animal. But most people would look at them and say, well, then these are not really animals being represented. They're just tales of humans. So, in the case of, they're sort of personifications, or, these are just, the tortoise is just a slow person, the hare is a fast person. They're not really based on observation of animals. But I wanted to actually disagree with that. And I said, well, I think in many cases, and not all cases, and not all fables involve animals, they're actually based on observation of animals. And I mean, a really good example, I love the story of sour grapes, when the fox can't reach the grapes and goes, oh, I didn't, I'm sure they're sour anyway, whatever. And that's where we get that expression, sour grapes. But during this writing of the book Animal Fables After Darwin, I learned that foxes like grapes, right? So it's really, so they're actually based on a sort of ethological understanding, which is really interesting. And so I mean, I've just sort of where I am now is I'm suddenly interested in how we tell fables about machines. And so how in this age of AI are we kind of sort of telling those symbolic stories involving machines as the central characters, and that's the sort of the latest work. So there's a sort of trajectory from the PhD, but it's been I think I love animals too. It just comes from a sort of my own life,
a combination of all the things you enjoy.
Yeah. There was another one, Ella and I were talking about another fable that was, it's similar to that fox one, but it's about a crow.
The Crow in the Pitcher.
Yeah, that one, and how it is actually based off science.
So the fable is about a crow who wants to get some water in a pitcher, who can't reach its little crow head and beak into the pitcher enough to drink. So it fills the pitcher with stones so that the water is at a level where the crow can then drink from it. And apparently at the same time as this fable was being spread widely, there also began to be people who were studying behaviours of crows and saw this exact behaviour happening. And later down the line, it led to studies of corvids, so the type of bird family, and showed that crows and other corvids can understand buoyancy and solids. And it's very interesting to see this, again, mixing of science and fables.
Yeah, I think it's interesting from the SciComm perspective, the science communication perspective. It's not really talked about. Fables are not really, at least that phrasing isn't used in SciComm. We're very interested in narratives and storytelling and how that can help convey complex ideas and concepts from science and technology. But nobody is talking about fables specifically. Which is an interesting observation that I made.
I think one reason for that is this, this double meaning, which literature has a little bit itself, like fiction does. But a fable is a story, involving animals or a non-human character. But a fable can be a lie, or it's just a story. This idea is just a story. So it's almost like to make it more serious, we say, well, no, narrative. Sort of
true. I know
narrative is the way of making it.
The scientists who were they're still very, no, it needs to sound official. That being said, I did find one group of scientists who were, using fables as a science education tool for teaching lab safety. So they would get their like students to write a fable with a animal with a like moral lesson in it about if they used a piece of lab equipment in an unsafe way or whatever, unsafe chemical, that sort of thing, which is interesting.
Yeah, I'm kind of stuck on this thought of how seriously we take fables, and I feel like another element in it is not taking seriously folklore or traditional storytelling that isn't necessarily written down. I think still in science communication we have that flow-on effect of deciding science has to be written down and everything that isn't written down isn't science, which is very contrasting to a lot of traditional knowledges too, particularly like First Nations knowledges in Australia and New Zealand, Canada, and kind of having to argue that all knowledge ways are important and that there is science as part of other knowledge ways, but sometimes that's more a holistic knowledge way than just one stream. Science started out as such a specific, here we're carving out the lines where science can sit. And I still think in science communication we're trying to widen those lines a little bit and break down a little bit of the ivory tower, but I still think there's a lot of that hesitance in there from the traditions of Western science.
I mean, one of the reasons I studied fables is that I was, trying to recuperate the reputation. So the reason, it's a sort of, it was seen as a kind of form of children's literature, maybe.
Yes.
People, and children were, as far as I understand, we do read these stories, but I think people forget how we used to treat children a bit differently. Like they're not as infantilized as we treat them today. But so this idea of having a moral, sort of being substandard, in literary studies, it's this idea of fable, it's fine to have fables and tell stories about animals, but as long as they don't have morals, sort of that moral element somehow makes them less sophisticated. But something that really important just to understand about traditional fables, I think, is that they're often, it's a bit of practical wisdom. It's not really a moral. So I mean, if the moral is slow, I mean, I really identify with the tortoise. I do things. My sign, Chinese star sign is ox. So I'm sort of very slow and steady. And the point is a sort of practical point, right? It's not like if we understand moral as in, well, if you do, it's not an ethical behavior. If you do this, this is seen as a good behavior or something. It's a kind of practical bit of advice. So fables, even traditional fables, have very practical focuses, and that part of the, there was sort of, I think, a form of educative, storytelling. Sort of a kind of an example using animals or some other sort of non-human creature to sort of make a practical a point, and we've sort of lost sight of that. And I wanted to show how that the writers are still interested in that kind of wisdom tradition, and then as soon as you get into that kind of wisdom tradition, you go, well, we're often reading literature for things like intelligence, sophistication, but where's what's that expression, clever not wise, or something like that. Fables are about being wise and not just about being clever. And so I was just really attracted to that, and that sense of which they're based on observations, like with the crows. There's a sort of practical aspect of observing nature and seeing your connection with animals and so on. That produces that fable.
Yeah, that that practicality and the attraction that drew you to kind of standing up for fables, to me is very reminiscent of in science communication we're often trying to make really specific knowledge more accessible to a wider audience, and we're really pushing back against the idea that taking out jargon or explaining it in common language isn't dumbing down the science, but making it reachable. And I think maybe there's this complementary story between being able to explain someone's PhD to a 12-year-old is important, such as also giving children morals or fables or practical advice to grow up with is also important. And sometimes the most important stories and narratives and fables should start with children, because that's a really good age to learn some really cool things. So yeah, those are just ideas that are.
I mean, something that
bouncing
fascinates
around.
me about fables is the sense in which, if you look at them as I mean, one reason I say couldn't understand why people weren't interested in the fable is that this is a story form involving non-humans, right? So
exactly.
if we say we're in this time of the Anthropocene when, we're destroying the environment and we're becoming this overwhelming force on the planet, and how do we mitigate that force? Well, we've got a storytelling tradition that is all about that, and people were just ignoring it. So
I think elements of that too are people finding it like subconsciously confronting as well, because they're like, oh, I don't want to have to think about like animals and what we're doing to animals and the environment and all of that.
Yeah. I mean, one of the writers I was interested in that Fables project was Coetzee, and he was kind of J.M. Coetzee, the sort of now Australian author, who's fascinated by the way that we treat animals, and he sort of would want to draw attention in his fables to our mistreatment of animals. And I mean, I think another central point to the sort of modern problem with the fable is that in a lot of urban life, I mean, thankfully not in a city like Canberra, but we've sort of lost connection with animals, and so there's a sense in which, because we don't feel connected to animals, we feel like we can't tell stories about them. So I think, for me, that was always a kind of intuition, is that the more comfortable you are with a subject, or familiar with a subject, the more comfortable you are using telling stories about that thing. And, so people's fear of anthropomorphism, people say, oh, but these are just anthropomorphized characters. Well, part of that, I think, comes from the sense that we don't know, we don't have contact enough with animals, and so we don't know which bits of anthropomorphism are more accurate than others,
I want to kind of lead us talking about a part of the prologue in your book, Animal Fables After Darwin. And you made an interesting point about non-human animals, such as great apes, being described as disabled humans who should be, quote unquote, uplifted to the same intellectual level as humans, which is a proposition that your book argues against. And I was really interested in your thoughts on relationship hierarchy of humans and animals, and also AI and machines.
Yeah, so that point, I mean, I sort of quoted that point in order to oppose it. But it is an idea that comes from science fiction, this idea that somehow we can sort of cognitively uplift species. And I mean, I find it very Anthropocene, because the idea is we sort of represent some kind of norm, and so you want to somehow, I remember a discussion about the dolphin coming to Parliament, sort of a talking dolphin in Parliament, an animal parliament. But the idea is really, this is just, there can be sort of this negative anthropomorphism where that's just taking, what we do and saying that all the animals should do it themselves, and so what I was arguing in the book is that, I mean, there is an interesting sense in which fables involve uplifting, because, animals speak in fables. There's a sort of concession, sort of giving speech, which is, you could say is a sort of uplifting feature. But the argument was something like, well, they do that in order to sort of lower the human, So a lot of fables are sort of undermining, the human feeling of superiority over animals. And something I was really fascinated in Animal Fables After Darwin is this idea of verticality, right? So humans, we're upright creatures, so we stand up. And I'm fascinated by how, physiology does dictate sort of our value system. So the idea with sort of being vertical creatures is that, we stand upright, we look at the stars, we're the animal that sees the universe, sort of is, and we have expressions like, so that person is upright, morally upright and so on. Whereas animals are four-legged, animals are on the ground. And so I was fascinated by this type of fable that played with that vertical order and sort of said, well, maybe we're taking a notch, taking us down a notch on the ladder of being by sort of saying, well, we're just like the other animals. We're not sort of, superior animals. So the fables sort of that play with this, I call it an orientational metaphor. So sort of the work of Lakoff and Johnson, sort of on metaphors we live by. So sort of up and down, human is up, animal is down.
Yeah.
We kind of, that's a key sort of value system that we, often descriptions of animals, that person was acting like an animal. Like what we mean is that person is lowering themselves. And so what I was trying to recuperate in the book is that's not necessarily a bad thing. These fables that are interested in make that point that, maybe we should see ourselves, so after Darwin, we are animals, we're acknowledged as we're a type of ape. So, that these points like Franz Kafka's The Reporter in Academy, where Red Peter's an ape, sort of talking about his transition into being a human. I mean, he pokes fun at the sense in which humans think of themselves as superior, and he thinks it's no great thing to be a human. The story is basically gets captured in in the Gold Coast in Africa and taken back to be exhibited in a zoo. And he realizes, well, there's no way out. He has to just work out, either he goes into the zoo or he goes, well, I just learned to be human. That was my way out. Yes, it's not a great thing. It's just an escape route. So Kafka's there just poking fun at the humans. Like, you think, you're so amazing, but actually I've just done this because you were, a kind of predator who was threatening me, and this is my survival strategy. So that's a kind of example of this kind of post-Darwinian fable where, it's playing with that sort of vertical order, saying, just getting us to think. I mean, animal studies in general is just getting us to think, what does it mean to be human, and like do these things we associate with the human, which are amazing. I remember I would teach a course, at UNSW, my previous institution, called Animals, Monsters, Machines, and say, well, humans are amazing, but we have to balance that with we have lots of problematic behavior as well. So these writers are interested in that. And in terms of machines, hierarchy. It's a very complicated question. Yeah, I mean that's sort of one I'm sort of grappling with now. I mean, when I was thinking about the show, I was thinking, well, there are really all sorts of possibilities for that hierarchy. I think sometimes we see machines as inferior, sometimes we see them as somehow equal to us, sometimes we see them as superior. We have that fear. The project I'm doing now is basically about how our fear of AI is. So it has its origins in this moment of Darwinian evolution as well, where people suddenly started to say, well, machines might evolve, and then and they might become superior to us and take over. Yeah. So, I think again it's that sort of question of how comfortable we are with something. If we're uncomfortable, I think that fear of AI or fear of machines comes from an extreme discomfort with machines. But if we're more comfortable, maybe we can tell different kinds of stories, just the way that the fables that I've been looking at with animals sort of relax into a different kind of mode when there's not that sort of limitation on how we see them.
Yeah, so in the book that you're working on at the moment, Future Fables, which is kind of about all of that, and it's focused on how literary and scientific writers after Darwin rethink the future of humans by imagining the co-evolution of humans, animals, and machines. And I was just wondering if you could tell us more about that co-evolution of humans, animals, and machines, maybe what this looks like in fables or literature.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so the project is, it's really a kind of spin-off of the animal fables after Darwin, because, what the sort of starting point is the same point where I was just mentioning that there's people like Samuel Butler, a fantastic English author who spent a bit of time in New Zealand. George Eliot is another who said, suddenly realised, hang on, what happens if we think of machines as evolving? And they were literally saying, well, these machines might take over. And there's this sort of tradition, which I think we're still in now. I mean, we're sort of sitting here talking about ChatGPT, aren't we? And saying, well, are we going to become redundant? Are machines somehow going to render us redundant because they do things so much faster than us? But something that's been interesting doing the project is that I feel like underlying this fear of machines evolving and taking over, which is just machine evolution, it's not quite the co-evolution you're talking about, is that there's a kind of underlying animism. I actually sort of, along with being a literary anthropologist, I kind of declare myself an animist and believing that things are alive.
Yeah.
Right? And so this fear that we have of machines sort of coming to life is sort of underlying it, I think, is this belief that everything can be alive. And if everything can be alive, then you can start to fantasize and, well, things might take over us, And someone like Philip K. Dick is an author I'm interested in a lot. He seems quite paranoid about things taking over and being swallowed by machines and objects and so on.
I joked about this the other day with one of my colleagues because I'm using the printer a lot at work at the moment, and everybody is at the moment. There's giant papers that nobody needs to know the details of what it is that's going on. But we were joking about the printer like growing legs and coming after us because of how hard we're making it work. Yeah. So definitely like resonating with me.
I think it's a very natural thing to do. I'm fascinated by this concept of anthropomorphism, and anthropomorphism is basically projecting sort of human form onto other things, and this is what we do all the time, and I think it's a perfectly natural thing to do. And I think you can do it another way. You can do it sort of irresponsibly, so by making something very limited, or you can do it, you know, like in a critical way. Like, you know, people even, I don't do this personally, but people use this term like critical anthropomorphism, you know, so basically what that means is good anthropomorphism that you're using in a critical way. But I mean, I think,
okay, yeah,
you know,
that can be, I'm just realizing that's kind of misleading because people will think it's
critical
other way
of
around.
anthropology. Yeah, no, they mean it sort of, you know, so one way in university studies is to put the word critical before something, and then it makes it somehow better, more efficient. But
Critical fables.
Yeah, critical fables. But yeah, in terms of the coevolution is a really important question as well, because I think we're materially affected by what we interact with. And I mean, I was thinking, I mean, this is a way, I'm in the School of Cybernetics, and one way to mention cybernetics here in this really interesting conversation, I was thinking cybernetics has a sort of fabulous dimension, and you know, Norbert Wiener in his book says this, you know, a 1948 book, Cybernetics, says this really interesting point, is that each, you know, age sort of sees the world according to its kind of dominant automaton. And so, you know, in the 17th, 18th century, it's like clocks. So, you know, people suddenly go, oh, well, the universe is kind of like you know, everything's like a clock.
Yeah.
And then suddenly in the 19th century, it's the steam engine.
Yeah.
And in the, you know, in the 20th century when Wiener's writing, it's he thinks it's things like automatic doors or printed, you know, I mean, it'd be printed. I mean, printers didn't exist in those days. I'm thinking at least. I don't know the history of the printer. But, and so what happens is you start to see, you know, that, and for me, that's about a kind of coevolution. Like, you've got a relationship with these automatons. I mean, they're built by us. So we've sort of, these are machines that we've kind of co-evolved with, and suddenly we go, well, in this space of coevolution, we're suddenly seeing a way of explaining everything. And for Wiener, it was the fact that, say, an automatic door is something that senses its environment and responds to its environment. So it's sort of acting more like a person, right? So, and I've got quite fascinated. I mean, Philip K. Dick, you were just mentioning printers. I mean, in his novel Ubik, I mean, he has a door that won't let him out of the room. His character Joe Chip, he can't get out of the room because the door says, "Give me 10 cents or something to get out of the room." You know, it's like, it's a kind of hyper capitalist. You know, can you imagine your own door charging you to get out of the room? Yeah. And so this is, you know, Dick's just making fun of that idea of like, this is a thing that sort of seems human-like, or, you know, more like a landlord or something. Like, maybe that's why but it's everything, you know, the coffee machine house for money as well.
I think it's funny too how a lot of us will also are in a bit of a habit of talking to the machines back as well. Like, we'll be like, "Oh, my computer, why are you not working? Like, what's wrong with you?" Like,
I think that's perfectly normal.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Is that's something that we all do,
even if we know there's no sensors for the inputs we're trying to give it.
I mean, something that's fascinating me in this, I mean, this is the sort of, I don't know how to explain this, but the sort of radical part of what I'm trying to study is that if you imagine, I'm fascinated by the sense, if you imagine like you're interacting with a machine. So there's this, you know, so imagine Joe Chip sort of facing the door, or we're facing an automatic door. I mean, one way to look at that scenario is like, you know, there's a space between you and that door that responds to you. And there's questions to be worked out in this space. Imagine if you don't really know who you are. You know, the radical way of thinking about things is we don't know what the human is. So in order to understand the human, we have to look outside. So we have to study these things outside the human. So, and there could be animals. So in the work on, you know, animals, it's sort of, we look at other animals to work out how we're an animal. But this sort of, this radical premise of some of the work I'm doing is, what happens if you refuse to go inside and go, well, I know who I am. I'm intelligent, I'm conscious, I'm sentient. And you go, actually, let me look outside. I have to treat everything as a sort of anthropological experiment where what it means to be human, what it means to be anything is worked out in the space publicly, you know, outside of myself. And I think you can get some quite interesting analysis that way by analysing that space and not just retreating into sort of truths like, you know, well, the human is superior, the human is, you know, has a soul, like, you know, we have a soul, so but where is that soul? You know, people can't tell what consciousness, you don't know what consciousness is.
I think definitely in Western culture that's the case for sure. But then it's just thinking about Indigenous cultures and how they think about things is quite different as well. Like, they don't start from the same starting point. Like, they treat well, in First Nations Australia at least, it's very everything is treated as equal from the start, and that's how you grow up, like, learning about the world and how your like responsibility as a human is to maintain balance between all of it. It's not because you're like better than the kangaroo or whatever, but it's because that's your role, and that's how you create meaning out of your life, and that is told through several of their stories as well.
I mean, something that also draws me, I mean, that's a great point. Something that draws me to the fable is this. It's for me, it's a lack of focus on the individual. You know, so much Western thinking is individualistic, and so I mean, fables involve individual animals, but those animals sort of represent their species. So I find that really interesting.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Or an automatic door. I mean, is that individual? I mean, it can be.
Yes,
you can see it as individualized, or you can see it as like the
all automatic doors.
Automatic doors, and we have this desire, I think, to hold on to individuality. But fables, I think, teach us to let go of that, and there's a sort of spirit then of critiquing the individual and not worrying. You know, is it okay to have a kind of corporate sense of identity? You know, rather to be human rather than just to be, you know, my particular version of it. I think you can get a lot out of that. And, you know, there have been people like Amitov Ghosh has talked about, you know, in The Great Derangement, how literature seems to be obsessed about individuality. And so we've got this idea of the realist novel. And there's some truth to that. I mean, it's, you know, you need to sort of challenge that as well. But yeah, this focus we have on the individual. And, yeah, one of the reasons I love science fiction is for the same reason. It goes beyond that sort of focus on the individual. Because so many strange things happen to people. And, you know,
yes, usually not just
fiction.
one person.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a lot of literary fiction as exploring the human condition, but through like
totally
an individual viewpoint rather than kind of the reverse. Yeah, that's opening up a lot of doorways for me.
Yeah, I mean something I've become fascinated by in my work recently is this it's concept of crypsis, which is actually just a form of environmental camouflage, right? So this is where you know, we experience a stick insect disappearing on a branch. So, you know, a lot of animals have a survival technique of blending into the environment. So the one I'm particularly interested in, there's different forms of crypsis, but the one I'm interested in is called background matching. So that's where an animal disappears into its background. And what fascinates me about background, I mean, all kind of crypsis does this, but it presumes a perceiving subject. You know, I mean, what's fascinating, it doesn't have to be human, right? So this could be another organism perceiving it, and that raises fascinating questions about how are organisms seeing each other, because we're tricked
I love that
as well
stuff. Yeah,
all the time.
I love thinking about that.
But what I find fascinating about crypsis is the sense in which an individual organism disappears into its environment, and for me then takes on some of the characteristic of that environment.
Yeah.
I mean, so some of that characteristic of being belonging to its environment is the fact that it's evolved such that it is able to disappear. I mean, I just find that amazing that an animal like a fox, an Arctic fox, can evolve to be white and disappear in winter, or grey or brown in the summer and disappear into its environment in that context. But what happens then, that individual organism has a relation to its environment, and I find crypsis so beautiful because it expresses that. And so often when, say, if you imagine the end point of that process where the organism moves again, for me, you can actually be fooled. Like, so imagine you're walking along and you see a branch, you just register that as a branch, and suddenly the branch starts to move. I mean, your first thought is not really probably recognizing it as a worm or a snake or something. It's like, well, the tree is alive or something. You go, what's going on? And so crypsis expresses how organisms go from sort of the individual to sort of the environmental, and they almost represent the power of the environment at that moment for the perceiving subject. So I've become fascinated with that phenomenon because it sort of shows, that's a kind of illustration of how individuality doesn't matter, you know, and actually can hinder you, you know, can be a hindrance in surviving in those kind of situations.
Have you ever looked into slime molds? They're they're a really, really interesting collection of organisms that can sometimes form like one. They're normally I think they're single cell organisms, but sometimes they can come together and collectively form one larger organism that acts as one, but it's lots of different organisms that will then separate away again afterwards. I don't know. I think maybe you'd find that fascinating.
I mean, I've read things like, you know, slime mold, they form patterns which, you know, can be used for mapping, and, you know, sort of interesting ways in which you can see the relation between individual behavior and collective behavior.
Yeah.
And I mean, what fascinates me about that, again, is that thinking of relationality. I think that's what's so important, isn't it? That sense in which you're not just thinking about the individual organism. You're thinking about the organism as a, as a relation. You're thinking about the relation of the organism to the environment.
Very cybernetic.
Yes.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, for sure.
One thing that the three of us, kind of worked on at Cybernetics, or we were part of a project supporting you with the Cast Iron Canvasser, which is a story by Banjo Patterson. I thought that would be a really cool thing to bring up because all three of us can speak to it. And I'm also really interested in Australian works that are a part of Fables or potentially future Fables. So I wondered if maybe you could give our listeners kind of a little bit of what the Cast Iron Canvasser story is and how it relates to your work.
Yeah, so, and I should mention that this is work doing with Genevieve Bell,
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah, her.
We're working on this together, and it's become it's a fascinating project. But it's a really unusual story. I mean, what struck us about the story is how it's written in 1891 by Banjo Patterson, and it's essentially the story of an automaton, or a robot. So, and this is a really early story if you look at it in the sort of history of robot representation, and it's about an automaton that gets used essentially to be a book canvasser. So people, in those days, people would sell books by, sort of installments. So people would go to, in this case, the focus is people who would go to country towns and sell installments of books. And the story begins with this company of Sloper and Dodge in trouble, because basically what's happening, it's a very comic story. Their book canvassers, human book canvassers that is, are getting attacked, tarred and feathered by the people of 9 Mile. So there's basically an aggression from the place that they're trying to sell these books, and they're sort of going out of business. They're sort of trying to sell this book called the Picturesque Atlas of Australasia, which is sort of a colonial representation of Australia. It's a really interesting choice of that as the text that they're selling. So what they try to do is that one of them says, well, we've got this inventor genius who's sort of developed this cast iron canvasser, sort of this robot automaton, who can act as a book canvasser, right? And what's really interesting, and I've got a bit obsessed by this recently, is the canvasser speaks through a phonograph. So one of the latest technologies. So this is really interesting, just in this sense that. Patterson, who we often think of is kind of as a sort of creator of that myth of the bush of almost this timeless sort of writer of the bush, capturing its essence. But he's actually very historically engaged, and he obviously knows about Edison's invention of the phonograph. And so the cast iron canvasser speaks with this recorded words through a phonograph. But the story ends in disaster. He's sent to the town, and basically the townsfolk of 9 Mile treat him the same way as a human canvasser. They just attack him, and there's this tragic moment where the Sergeant O'Grady, I think he's called, is sort of makes this fatal mistake of touching. He sort of thinks that the canvas is drunk, right?
Yeah,
you think the canvas is a drunk human.
Yeah, sort of suffering the horrors was the expression that they used in those days. And so he sort of, I guess to try to calm him down, he kind of touches his palm, but this sort of sets off this reaction. The canvasser kind of grabs his arm because he's thinking he's got an order for a book, and pulls it to him, and he kind of grabs the sergeant and then sets off walking towards the river. And they end up in 9 Mile Creek, and the sergeant drowns, and it's a sort of strange, it's a macabre story sort of in the end. And but yeah, I mean, it's a sort of fascinating story of how, I mean, it's a fable in the sense of, there's a non-human character at the center. And how I've become fascinated by this problem of the phonograph, that fascinating, it's a part of the process of Patterson writing this story was that he must have, there was an exhibitor of the phonograph who came to Australia called Douglas Archibald, and he exhibited in 1890, the year before the story is written, the Edison perfected phonograph. This was a kind of improved version of the original. And so my bet is he must have gone to that, exhibition, and he must have then imagined, how could this be, how could I put it into a story? Right?
Yeah.
And, and it's also, I mean, it's also the way that, a fable in some sense confuses the sense of identity between the human and the animal, and in this case, the human machine. So what, what's going on, with that relationship between, does the and sometimes I think of the canvas almost as like a sort of empty space that sort of shows how the humans are treating each other, in the sense of the
that's a good point.
The 9 Mile, the townsfolk of 9 Mile are sort of aggressive towards human, and they treat the the machine the same way, but it's all much more exaggerated. So it's not there. Being a fable, you can kind of take it to the extreme. So where the sergeant ends up dead in the creek.
It's also interesting. Makes an interesting point about machines that we might think are advanced or like will do a better job than us. It's certainly in this story, the machine, 1, can't climb stairs, and 2, can't survive the harsh Australian outback, which is funny as well.
Yeah, so it does show in a way how adaptable humans are, doesn't it?
Yes,
And so part of the story, I guess, is this slow print dodge. It's a kind of industrial story. Like, we'll just sort this out with a machine. So machines can be superior in this kind of situation, and it's shown not to be. In some sense, I think there is my reading. I think is there's something anachronistic in the sense that Patterson is showing that there's a sort of weird wisdom in the people of 9 Mile, like to ignore it and to not sort of go, we'll go with the latest thing, and this is we'll buy into this kind of. So there's a sort of I'm fascinated. The way that an aspect of Patterson's storytelling, which is really interesting, he's fascinated by just sort of substituting humans, animals, and machines. And like in this story, for example, that it begins with the human canvas is kind of being dehumanized. Like, I love how nothing sort of stays itself. So like the human canvases go in and they're treated as animals, and then somehow the machine is treated as a human.
Who are being treated as animals.
Yeah, who are being treated as animals. And then there's a last stage to the story which I think is really fascinating too. They end up in the creek, and there's one version. There's actually 2 dominant versions of the story, and we don't quite know why. One, how they both arose. But in one version, there's a sort of extended end where it's sort of we can still hear the sound of the canvasser sort of trying to sell books or whatever in a creek. And I always thought that's what's happening there is sort of he's becoming part of the environment. So in the end, he's absorbed into the environment, and So the voice, the human voice, sort of, if you look at the phonograph as a machine of the human voice, is sort of, you've got the human canvases in the first case, then the machine canvasser, but in the end, the voice gets sort of absorbed into the environment, and I find that sort of fascinating. So the sense in which none of the identities sort of stay themselves, and he's just, there's one. I remember, I'll just tell this quick story of his very first story. I just found fascinating. It's called "How I Shot the Policeman," and what happens in this story is that it's Banjo's the central character, and he is studying, and he's annoyed by this horse that's kind of breaking sort of through the gate, so rattling the gate. And he comes up with this plan. He goes, I'm going to throw a weight at this horse and give it a shock, and so it doesn't come back. And he also has before that told about a policeman who probably has a drinking problem, like in the cast iron canvases reference, and then he's sort of doing the rounds. And so he hears in the dead of night this sort of sound of rattling of the gate, and he goes to throw, execute his plan of throwing the weight. But what of course happens is there's a comedy. The policeman is there, and so he gets knocked out by this, instead of the horse. So there's a sense in which, Patterson's fascinated by how, in that case, the human substitutes for the animal. So these spaces that open up, and I think cast iron canvases, all the identities of human, animal, and machine are kind of occupy its own position, but also another position, and the shifting of identity. And I think just he gets so many effects out of that sort of, I would call it fabulous substitution.
Yeah, so I wanted to sort of bring everything together by tying it back to SciComm a little bit, and the feedback between science and society and culture. And I'd love to hear your thoughts, Chris, on the relationship flow of knowledge between science or science history and the wider context of literature and literary history. You touched on it a little bit before, but I'd love to hear more thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by how writers use science, in their work, and also how scientists use fiction. It goes both ways. I think it's important to sort of say that. So, one way, say someone like H.G. Wells, and Jeff Vandermeer is another writer I'm really interested in who sort of say this. They say, in order to make things more credible, you need to actually scientifically research things.
Yeah.
So there's a sort of sense in which writers can kind of increase the plausibility of what they're saying by having that sort of knowledge of science. So, you know, say in something like Island of Dr. Moreau, H.G. Wells has got this understanding of xenotransplantation, you know, the sort of, you know, sort of operation, you know, transplanting material between species. And that's the basis for Moreau's experiments in sort of making the beast people in that novel. And, you know, Vandermeer's talked about how he's sort of infuriated by how people in science fiction don't find out enough about animals to write about them accurately.
Yeah, that's
you know,
interesting,
with
isn't
sort of
it?
how, you know, people are obsessed, say, with physics, you know, getting the physics right in science fiction, but not the sort of biology. And but there's something else I think that's very important, like is that the sense in which, you know, having, say, absorbed some scientific knowledge, there's no necessity just to treat it sort of sanctimoniously or whatever. You know, sort of you can exaggerate it. So, you know, these writers, what they do is they having taken in something, you know, say someone like Philip K. Dick, you know, we had a conversation about the automatic door, you can then exaggerate things in crazy ways, you know, to make a point. So there's a sort of fable there would be, or literature there would be, how does the scientific knowledge become extrapolated, you know, in fantastic ways or something like that. You know, so it's not just about, say, you know, sort of respecting the science and bringing it in. It's also about, well, what can you do with it? How can you, and, you know, this is where the literary writer might say, well, my sort of interest is in, you know, thinking about what it means to be human. So I'll use this, you know, sort of understanding of science to think about that. So, I mean, what I find fascinating, say, about in the Island of Dr. Moreau, is that Wells criticizes Moreau, sort of saying, well, the consequences of this sort of creating beast people is going to be disastrous, even though he, as a scientist, he sort of was pro-vivisection, right? So he actually believed. So there's something about the sort of logic of that story where you sort of play out the consequences. So one way that writers use science is sort of thinking about the ethical consequences of a sort of scientific practice, say, you know, and so, I mean, there's just so many different ways you can use it. I mean, another way, you know, getting back to that conversation about crypsis, I mean, you can then use scientific concepts that sort of cross over. So, you know, when I say something like, you know, so for biologists, I'm presuming crypsis would be mainly a sort of survival technique or a communication between organisms. But what happens if you say, well, it's a way of understanding our relation to the environment?
Yeah.
You know, like someone like Akiko Bush, who I've quoted in an essay, sort of says, well, that you know, we need to blend into our environment more. We need to sort of use crypsis as a sort of model for how we are interacting with our environment. So then that becomes a sort of scientific concept that's sort of passed over into the humanities, or whatever you want to call it, and then being used as a way of talking about who we are and what we should do and how we should act and so on. So, yeah, I really believe in that sort of that trading relation between science and I think, I mean, it's probably fair to say that, you know, writers have probably always been interested in this, because I think writers just have that, you know, omnivorous kind of attitude to things, you know, that they want to find out about things. I mean, whether it always goes the other way, you know, I mean, this is the debate about two cultures, you know, whether, you know, science could, I mean, I think science could do really well with more fabulating, you know.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, seeing that it's not talked about in science communication as well, I was like, yeah, I think it's something we could be looking into for sure.
People like, you know, Huxley, you know, J.B.S. Haldane, these were science writers who, you know, would actually tell fictional stories within their scientific essays, and, you know, and I think so that cross-pollination can be so productive, you know, for both areas. And yeah, I mean, we live in this kind of world of high specialization. It becomes harder, but I think that sort of generalization would be great.
Oh, what a good chat. This was, I think, a really, really cool point to end on, and to prompt our listeners to think further based on the great conversation we've had today. And some questions that, you know, might help guide some cool thoughts for them are, where are the other points in history you've seen feedback between scientific discoveries and literature? And I think right at the end there we got to some really cool ones, but I'm sure there are a lot more, and I think I definitely would be better off for knowing knowing some more and exploring those a little bit too.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear about if anyone's seen any more science-related messaging in fables as well, and what other kinds of fables people have seen or are aware of.
And one really great way that we've been ending our episodes recently, Chris, is asking you, our fantastic guest for the episode, to recommend our listeners 3 pieces of media. And they don't have to be related to anything you've spoken about. They can absolutely be related if you want, but they can be a book or a movie or a board game or fridge music or anything. But as we're a pop culture science podcast, we think it's a really fun way to close it. And for you to be able to share some maybe of your favorite things with the listeners.
Yeah, no, thanks. One thing I've already mentioned, I think Ubik, this is something I've just read recently, Philip K. Dick's Ubik. I think it's a great, it's a kind of surreal novel.
Yeah.
I think that's definitely, if you're interested in appliances that talk to you and talk back sarcastically to litigate, that's a great text. I loved the series on Netflix called Pluto. I don't know if you heard. It's a kind of Astro Boy story.
Oh, I love Astro Boy.
Yeah, it's a kind of it's a really interesting, it combines these two things which I love, which is a sort of detective fiction, and it's about human robot relations. So it's a kind of what would you call it, a sort of story within the Astro Boy world.
Okay.
It's an adaptation of that story, and I think it's really really fascinating. I think a third thing, this is another discovery. A Korean writer, Bo-young Kim. She's written a fantastic collection of stories called On the Origin of Species and Other Stories, and it's sort of right down my alley in the sense of it's applying ideas of evolution to machines. So it sort of tells these, includes machine characters in the story of evolution.
Yeah.
And,
awesome.
And the title story is about that, about a kind of robot character that discovers biological life. It's just fascinating. So that's one of some stories you just sort of, I buy a lot of books just, I guess, on spec, and, I picked up this book and I just was so drawn into it. And then those moments, I love those moments when you're reading it and it's unforgettable. You sort of read the story and it just kind of burns itself into you. And it's almost like you don't need to read it again because it's just kind of, it's hit you at exactly the right moment. So that was an example of that for me.
Oh, those are all great. Thanks,
Cast iron canvasser, I guess. Of course. We should always.
We should always recommend
We love the
that.
cast iron canvasser.
Yeah, that's true.
That's freely available online.
Yeah, and look for the versions where you can see the illustrations. I think that's a really good.
I think I had to pay for those though.
Oh, devastating. I just think it's a really good entry point is to see how early Australians in 1890s and a little bit further on when we had illustrated editions were starting to view robots.
Yeah. The illustrations of it for sure. Yeah, well, thanks so much, Chris, for those recommendations, and thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah.
That was great. I think that was an amazing discussion. Good. Thank you, listeners, as always. Stay nerdy, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.
Thank you to ANU CPAS for their support and access to their podcast studio.